All right. Thank you for joining me. My name is Daniel. Uh, in lieu of uh, another meeting with Bates and video with Bates, going to do a little bit of a educational video this week. So in this movement towards organizing ourselves in a different way, part of that is literally looking at the way that we organize ourselves personally, internally, and then as communities, as groups of people within relationship with each other. And there's a lot of parts, and we're going to talk about those parts here in a minute. These parts are can be on a personal, individual level, but are also expressed in a relationship or communal level. And we're going to talk about both of them, mostly focused on it as relationship, community level, but I'll also talk about how it applies on a personal level. Because all of these things have helped me do the work to get to where I'm at right now in order to be able to actually put these things into action outside of just figuring my own shit out. So what we're going to go over today is originally came to me through a lady by the name of Diana Leafe Christian. She is a facilitator and organizer within the context of intentional communities. I want to say she lives out of Asheville, North Carolina, an intentional community out there, but she's been living in intentional communities for over 40 years. She's written several books about it, specifically living in community, and then the other one is like finding community or something like that. Both of them about living in intentional community. One specific to creating your own intentional community, while the other one's about finding an existing one. But she's gone and lived in intentional communities all over the United States and the world maybe even, and studied them from a process and a systems analysis kind of a way of looking at things rather than just, business practices or, what skills do you need, that kind of thing. But what makes for successful intentional communities? And she's come up with her system, and I borrowed heavily from it. But I'm also going to give my own spin to it and use slightly different language when I'm talking about specific sections of it. It's kind of like a pie chart. We're going to get to that here in a second. So hopefully you can see what I'm about to write on here. My markers aren't the greatest, so I'm going to use the ones that are working the best. So what makes for good, healthy, thriving communities that are, well, healthy is the word that I like to use, but that are capable of moving through the social landscape that we have available to us right now, adapting to it, and moving beyond it, surviving, and continuing to thrive within and without it, regardless of what that looks like. So, to start with, you go to the center, you start in the middle. One of the key elements, the holiest, I would say, almost, because it's out of this that everything comes out of it. But it's our values. And don't know if you can see that, but yeah. So our values are right there in the middle. And in this work of like organizing with people, like, you know, there's several different ways of going about this. You can sit around at a table and hash out your values. There's organic ways of letting that just naturally happen throughout the conversation that's being had. Conflict will come up and it'll help you really hone in on what you value. I don't see conflict as a bad thing. It's an opportunity for growth, always. And honestly, I don't even like the term conflict. I like the term contrast. It lets us see, you know, if we're trying to stay within our values, things that are not within our values become very apparent very quickly, very easily. But it requires us staying in our values. So how, as a group, do we stay in our values? How, as an individual, do I stay in my values? Well, personally, I like the term Don Juan or Carlos Castaneda came up with, and I hear a lot within these offshoots of this tradition, but it's impeccability. Bates and I have gone around the term integrity quite a bit, but I like impeccability because it's like I'm living through my values, period. That's what moves me and how I'm. You always know what I'm going to do in a certain situation because I'm going to live my values in that situation. And so if you know my values, you know what I'm going to do for the most part. You know. But how do, like on a practical level, how does that get expressed within the context of a community, within the context of Chi Ministries? One of the things that Bates and I have spent quite a bit of time talking about and putting into practice in other social situations is, it's a form of governance called sociocracy. There are other iterations of it. Holacracy is another one. Dynamic governance is a name that it goes by. It's similar to the Occupy style of decision making. Notice I'm not using the term voting because we're not going to vote. There's no voting. There is decision making. And so I'm going to write that down here. And one of the keys is a healthy decision making process. And I'm going to put governance up here as well. There are different names for it. There's different ways of looking at it. But having a healthy governance system that is horizontal, concentric circle based, egalitarian, kind of has to hit a lot of different bases. Having studied a lot of that, like I said, the sociocracy style decision making process is where it's at for me. And I think at our level where we're at right now, we're approaching the point where a full-fledged sociocratic dynamic governance rounds-based system would behoove us to train in. But at its core, the decision-making process is what makes it run. And if we hold on to the decision-making process and live it through our values, it just, everything else kind of works itself out. And that decision-making process is basically each one of us sitting in a circle and answering two questions. Does it live our values? Always goes back to that. And two, is it safe enough to try? Can it work right now? Is it healthy? something along those lines. It's not a question of whether or not I think it's the right answer. Does it make logical sense? No. It's does it live our values? Is it safe to try? Kind of takes the ego out of the equation for us. All right, so this is our core. And honestly, like I said, individually speaking, even that's how I make my decisions. Does it live my values? Is it safe enough to try right now? Is it healthy enough to try right now? Would it work? And that's pretty much it. I know that sounds simple, but it's out of those two questions that I'm able to, I've come to the position where I'm at, like mutual aid and wanting to live together in a different way. All of that comes from wanting to live my values and seeing that I can't do it in the system outside of us. So anyways, how do we do that as a group? So we have to have an agreed upon system of governance, an agreed upon decision making process that always, ever more continuously and constantly, ritualistically lives our values mindfully in every moment. All right, so that's the center circle. I'm going to draw the general circle. So this is the whole of the community here, and the different core aspects of a successful, healthy, thriving, abundant, any of those buzzwords you want to use, community. I apologize that my colors aren't bolder and that you can't see this better. Anyways, so I'm going to go ahead and go with the next one because it's the one that everybody loves and always wants to focus on, and it took me a good time to understand the value of it outside of the stimulation that it provides. So these are aspects of healthy, thriving communities. So once we've got our values and we're living our values through a governance system and a decision-making process, we're going to start making decisions together, and probably the first things that we're going to wind up making decisions together are going to look like what Diana Leafe Christian calls community glue. I'm just going to call it glue. Because it works, it works on the relationship level, the community level, all that stuff. So we've got glue. What does glue look like? Glue looks like potlucks. Glue looks like intention circles. At its essence, glue is ritual, ceremony, and it's generally celebration. Funerals are glue, all those things are glue, but the vast majority of them are going to be in celebration. So the fun stuff. Your values, your governance system, your decision making are going to inform how these things work together. I will tell you from experience, you can come together for years at a potluck with no established values, governance system, or decision-making process, and it will fall apart. You'll just spin your wheels for a year. It might be fun, but it's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to have direction. So, let's see here. My video just went away. There we go. All right. So the glue, I mean, don't get me wrong though, you have to have it. Like I said, it's a big chunk here. It's what gets us from one week to the next. The ritual part, I mean, if you know me and you've paid attention to how I work, you've seen me doing what I do, you will know that I don't do anything without a potluck. I mean, that's just kind of how I do it. I always do potlucks. Why? Because they're magical. And then I make them a ritual. Why? Because it's by creating that momentum through a sustained movement at an interval basis. It's like creating a weight. You know, you're just doing something over and over again, creating a drum beat, creating a rhythm, creating a pattern, and that creates energy and has the ability to move out and create change in the world around it. But without this right here, without the values and the decision making and the governance, flat, doesn't go anywhere. But this gets people moving, gets them energized, gets them excited. It's Pentecostal church, you know. We used to call it a Holy Ghost picnic or Pentecostal picnic because that's what church was for us, you know. It was that emotional, spiritual high. All right, so let me go to the next one over here. I'm going to do, let's see which one I'm going to do next. I'll do this one next. So, the next section is gotta have it. Process and language. Diana Leafe Christian used a different label. I don't remember what it is. You're going to have contrast, you're going to have conflict, and it's not just going to be something that your governance and decision making through your values can be the end all be all to. You have to know how to navigate those landscapes. So you have to have process. One of the ones that has come out of the Black Lives Matter movement, it's been around for far longer than that, but it's really gotten its foothold through it, is restorative circles. It's part of what's called restorative justice. It's I like healing justice personally, healing circles, if I'm going to brand it personally. But it's the same thing. It's being able to take the naturally occurring movement of energy that we label as contrast or conflict and navigating it in such a way that lends itself to healing for everyone that's involved. That doesn't necessarily always come in the form of punishment, so that doesn't appeal to some people. This goes back to values, right? So how do we want to deal with conflict? Do we want to deal with conflict in a punishment reward paradigm, or do we want to deal with conflict how do we all move through this and get healthy from it, you know? The other one that I wanted to put on here, language specifically, is one of my favorites, works for me. There's other variants, there's other ways of getting to this cognitive space but it's nonviolent communication. I've studied this process for years. It has its positives, its negatives, but if you just do anything else, just listen to Marshall Rosenberg, the guy who came up with it, and just listen to him, and you'll get it. And it helps you transform your language in such a way to where you're no longer using punishment and reward judgments in order to navigate the landscape of conflict, and it being able to use tools like nonviolent communication, like owning your emotional state, helps within the context of restorative circles, which also aids in this shit, your values and making decisions, and helps with how to deal with people when you're at potlucks and in attention circles, and they all play in together, and we're going to get into that here in a minute, how they interconnect. But I will say that any kind of process similar to nonviolent communication is imperative. You will, as a community, we won't last, as a church, we won't last without having those kind of tools available to us. And so in the light of that, I'm going to put a sliver in here because I'm going to say it this way, it doesn't necessarily take up a large portion of real estate when it comes to, like, let's say, budgets. But training and replication. Just like all forms of life, you have to learn how to do these things. You have to learn how to talk in a different way because we've been trained a different way to talk. You've got to learn to make decisions in a different way because we've been taught an unhealthy way to make decisions. Voting is unhealthy. I'm going to just keep saying that. Keep pointing that out. Make decisions together. Stop voting. We've been given unhealthy rituals. So we've got to train ourselves in these newer, healthier, maybe not even newer, but just healthier ways of acting and living. And then replication, just like all healthy forms of life, you've got to be able to replicate. It's part of the deal. If you're here, you got to replicate. So it's part of it. It's got to give back. So how do we do that? That is a big conversation. But I really wanted to focus on the training part. One of the things that I will continuously come back to whenever we're talking about decision making is, are we including the training and replication aspect of who we are and what we're doing in the decisions that we're making, even if we're making a decision about, who's cutting the grass tomorrow, whatever. All right, so on to the next one, the last bit here. And the name that I've given this is not going to sound correct. Because it seems like, I've already talked about that in restorative circles and training, decision making, all that kind of stuff. But this is the stickiest part of any community coming together and taking care of their needs together is, one, how they engage with the outside world. So in the context of Diana Leafe Christian's diagram on this, she calls this section effective project management. And that can take the form of, a business or a group of businesses that take care of the financial needs of a community. So let's say, for instance, the farm up towards Nashville, like they have a farm, they have a co-op, I think is what it is, something like that. You'll see that with a lot of intentional communities. And then, like, let's say with community organizations, well, look, Chi Life Ministries, we've got Chi Farms, which is the food CSA, food delivery service. And that falls under what we would typically, within the business world, within the outside community, within the world, would look at as like, how do we make money? How do we pay the bills? What kind of businesses are we running? What's our budget look like? That whole model of approaching getting our needs met, right? And so, like, when she would talk about this section right here, she's talking about, how you have to do research on the market, are you going to be able to do this? Do you have the right kind of business licenses? All that kind of stuff. And I'm going to put down here, like, some of the parts that I put that I would put under this, like, let's say specifically for Chi Life Ministries. So we've talked about yard sharing. So a yard share CSA. We've talked about, let's say Chi Farms. What else here? Community Land Trust. One more. Trades, skills. Excuse my inability to write. So I'm writing all these things up here that, like, business type things and community land trust, trades and skills, But yet I put it under the title of relationship management, and that's because I don't want us to fall into the trap of doing what the world does over again, because the way that it gets done in the world always leads to concentrated power, concentrated wealth. We don't want one person to be making the most money. Shit like that, So in order to not look at it that way, we have to look at it as to what it really is at its core. Because at its core, we don't have any other resources other than our relationships. That's it. And I'll make it about gardens. The soil in the ground, the seeds that we use, everything that we either purchase or acquire in order to build a garden, to maintain a garden, we either went out and found it within the context of the person of the world, so out in nature, so a relationship with plants, the soil, animals, the land, or we went and purchased it through another human being or acquired it from another human being. So it always comes back to the relationship that we have. So do we have a healthy relationship with the land? You know, do we have a healthy relationship with the people that we're exchanging with? And then approaching Chief Arms, let's say specifically, the fact that it becomes more about a relationship with the land, with the act of meeting our own needs. And it is filtered through our values and through a healthy decision-making process. You know, and we're feeling good because we've been getting that spiritual, you know, feeding from potlucks and intention circles, and we have a language and a process to express authentically this thing that it is that we're doing. Chief Arms becomes something else that no matter what contrast or conflict comes up, that we can handle that. And we can move through it. We can figure out how people are going to get paid. We can figure out all these other things. We can figure out how our needs are going to get met. We're going to figure all those things out because, as Mr. Miyagi would say, root is strong, Daniel-san. So if we have strong root, have strong karate. That's Karate Kid 2 for any of you who wanted to know. So, anyways, that's pretty much what I got. And it was a little longer than I wanted it to be. But these are the things that we're going to really start focusing on when it comes to, as we're organizing ourselves into this thing called Chi Life Ministries. You know, we're going to start focusing on making sure that these different aspects of a healthy community, a healthy church, are going to be taken account of. I did want to go through one last thing. How these things interconnect is going to be important, something that we'll get into when we get into governance. And I think my next video, whether Bates and I do one together again next, I'm not sure, but my next one will be about values. So we'll really hone in on values in this circle. But what we want to see within all these subsections are what are called double linking circles. So each one of these circles has a way in and a way out for information to flow at all times, with each one of the subsections. And that includes inside and outside the circle. Now, what that looks like on a practical level is going to be different for each one of the sections of the circles. You know, your in and out in your process and language aspect of the church might be someone we've contracted in or paying to come and teach us nonviolent communication. Whereas in the glue, that might look like inviting people to come to potluck. You know, again, in and out in all the levels, but that looks different from each one, and how they're connected to each other would look different to than how they're connected to the outside of the circle as well. Each one of these circles is going to have members that are in both circles, so that you always have a check and balance on the information that's coming in and out of the circles. But we'll get into that when we get into governance and start talking about
Sociocracy.
and values. Uh, so yeah, we can probably get someone to make this for us on I don't know, something like a PowerPoint, I guess. Somebody help me with that. I'm not good at this stuff. Make it a little more legible, maybe. Anyways, thank y'all for paying attention and listening. Love you. Bye.